Please be advised this podcast deals with crimes against children. Please take care when listening.
This is a story of a resistance by a group of individuals who for too long have been smeared by police, preacher, district attorneys, popular prejudice, and the press as child molesters. The resistance developed in response to a witch hunt against homosexuals in general and boy lovers in particular. The Boston sex scandal is, more importantly, also the story of a resistance begun by a few radical homosexuals, which built on the gay community so that, for the first time, the gay movement embraced gay pedophiles and their cause and fought back. The Boston sex scandal is the history of a beginning.
What you just heard are direct quotes from the book The Boston Sex Scandal by John Mitzel, published by Glad Day Books, 1980. The book reads like a manifesto for pedophiles, and it's one of the most thorough documents on the history of what was then called child prostitution and now known as human trafficking of children in Massachusetts in the 1970s. This is Open Investigation, a true crime podcast about the search for answers to the disappearance of my childhood friend, Andy Puglisi, and the incredible story of dozens of other missing children who disappeared or were found murdered around the same time Andy vanished, all while a hidden network of human trafficking was thriving in our community. I'm your host, Melanie Perkins McLaughlin. Episode 3, The Other Boston Sex Scandal. The stories in this episode are so complicated. I've done so much research over the years, and the more research I do, the more research there is to be done. I could honestly do an entire series just on this episode, and maybe I will in the future. But for now, let's stick to this episode so that we can better understand how it all relates to Andy and the other missing and murdered children, especially given the context of the 1970s. There's a lot of information in this episode and a lot of names. There'll be character descriptions on our website, along with a detailed timeline, so that you can follow along when and if you have any questions. You can reach me by email, openinvestigationpod@gmail.com. Our website address is openinvestigationpodcast.com. This episode is dedicated to all the kids who came forward to share their story, and to those of you out there listening who haven't shared yours yet. Hopefully, by listening to the series and to other survivors, you'll understand that there's empowerment in telling your truth and being supported by your community. And it's okay if you're not ready yet. Just know that there's a community of survivors and that you're not alone. We believe you. The story begins in Massachusetts in the 1970s. It is the modern history of human trafficking of children. In fact, it's the open to John Mitzel's book, The Boston Sex Scandal. He starts with a story of Dick Bavley, a supervisor in the Roxbury, Massachusetts Department of Public Welfare Social Services Agency. The agency is responsible for the welfare of children and families and for placing foster children in foster homes. Today it's called the Department of Children and Families, but the name changes often. The author Mitzel portrays Dick Bavley as a martyr of sorts. We think the record will show otherwise. We've interviewed former foster children and what was then called child prostitutes. Please be advised this episode deals specifically with trafficking of children. Please take care. Act 1, Dick Bavley. In April of 1975, Supervisor of Social Services Richard Dick Bavley was found dead while under investigation for defrauding his employer, the Department of Public Welfare, the state agency created for the protection of children and families. Bavley, who in addition to being a social worker was a Vietnam veteran with a license to carry firearms, was allegedly placing foster children, teenage boys to be more specific, in homes with men who at the time were referred to as known homosexual single men and ultimately were known as pedophiles. To be clear, homosexuality is not confused with pedophilia, but in the 70s, the term pedophile was not part of the lexicon, and the sexual revolution and the gay rights movement was just starting to take off. In fact, you'll learn self-identified pedophile groups were trying to attach themselves to the legitimate gay rights movement, claiming we're denying children the right to have a sexual identity, but their efforts were rejected by the gay community. According to the Boston Globe, Dick Bavley was first implicated when a 15-year-old boy who was a runaway from a psychiatric hospital and a ward of the state allegedly committed suicide using Dick Bavley's gun. When the police realized the gun belonged to Dick Bavley, a social worker supervising foster children, they began asking questions. especially when they learned Dick Bavley had placed a foster child with himself under what was supposed to be an emergency care and protection, 24 to 48 hours at the most. The boy was with Dick Bavley from the time he was 13 until the time he was 15, when the police showed up after the boy's friend allegedly shot himself with Dick Bavley's gun. I was able to find Dick Bavley's former foster son, and this is the story he told me.
Well, first, let me just say that I was a foster child that lived with him. He was my legal guardian. I was living with a legal guardian who was placing foster children or street kids with pedophiles. That was a runaway. I had to do survival sex as a kid. I was like 12, 13 years old when I hit the streets. And what happened is a kid that I knew that I brought over to Bavley's because I thought he could help him. He wanted to go back to his foster home. And I met him over another pedophile's house. And so I brought him over to Bavley's. I figured he was talking to Dick. I was tired. I figured the kid would just sleep on the couch, you know what I mean? And then that's when I came downstairs to use because the bathroom was on, at the foot of the stairs. And as I was going to the bathroom, I looked at, Bavley's bedroom was to the left there, and the kid was in bed with him, and I said, oh, geez.
Police discovered that Dick Bavley authorized payments of more than $19,000 to a fictitious foster mother named Mary McGrath. $19,000 in 1973 is the equivalent of $125,000 today. Here's Dick Bavley's former foster son, who has asked that we don't use his name for obvious reasons. He was 15 years old when Bavley died. He's 63 years old today, and it's still like it was yesterday. You'll hear a clicking noise in the background. It took a little while for me to figure it out. The former foster son was clicking his lighter out of nervousness as he was talking.
He was stealing money from the state. He stole, that they know of, about $20,000 at the time. That was a lot of money back in the early 70s. Checks would go to Mary McGrath post office box. Dick was saying, gay kids with gay men. I mean, that was the thing, But it sounded better than putting runaways with pedophiles. I never even heard the term pedophile until later on in life. I mean, that term was never, we were chicken, young kids were chicken, and the pedophiles were Johns. I never heard that term on the street,
So in other words, Supervisor of Social Work Dick Bavley for the Department of Public Welfare, the Child Protection Agency in Massachusetts, was allegedly embezzling money for the purpose of payment for caring for foster children that he allegedly placed with what was then called known single homosexual men who were actually pedophiles, while claiming the children were placed with a woman, Mary McGrath, who did not exist. In the book The Boston Sex Scandal, author John Mitzel writes of rumors that Dick Bavley was running a gay prostitution ring, trafficking teenage boys to pedophiles in the name of what Mitzel and his colleagues call man-boy love. In addition to being a social worker, Dick Bavley volunteered at one of the first ever homes for runaway children, Project Place in Boston, Mass. Lillian Jackson worked at Project Place with Dick Bavley. Here's what she has to say.
A group of Harvard Divinity students, 5 of them, that started Project Place to deal with underserved people, and it was mainly homeless people and runaway kids. So we were dealing with severe abuse and neglect and trying to figure some of this stuff out, trying to protect some of these kids. And so that's kind of how it all started. I do remember Dick fairly well. At the time, he was a supervisor, and we had no reason not to trust him. We were aware of people praying that this was a vulnerable population, so we were really careful. If people we didn't know came to the runaway house with these kids, we wouldn't let them in. We did what we could, but we had no reason to doubt Dick. He really seemed to have a relationship with the kids. When all happened, we had no idea. As I recall, we found out by the newspaper. I guess he had access to other kids as well.
Did Dick Bavley ever abuse you?
Yeah. He'd say, come here, champ. Come here, champ. He used to call me champ, We'd talk at night around bedtime. And he said, come on, lay next to me. So I did. Nothing happened. I felt, I would fall asleep, and in the middle of the night, I woke up because he was fondling me, and I pulled away from him, because it freaked me out. I just pretended that I was sleeping, and I just rolled over, and got his hand off me, and he would pretend that he was sleeping. I mean, we would wrestle at times, and he kind of grabbed my crotch, I don't know, but that happened a couple of times where I slept, we'd talk, and I just give him the benefit of the doubt that he was doing. This was called taking place while he was in his sleep, and he didn't know it, but
Right.
obviously, I knew that he knew, and he knew that I knew.
He would just pretend.
But we didn't want each other to know. I don't know. It's a crazy situation. But he treated me like a prince. I got to tell you, anything I wanted, I had. He got me karate lessons. He bought me one of those mini bikes. He sent me to horseback riding camp.
On April 17th, 1975, disgraced supervisor of social work Dick Bavley died by suicide, overdosing on drugs while under investigation for the suspected trafficking of foster children to pedophiles, and the embezzlement of tens of thousands of dollars from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of Public Welfare. Dick Bavley's obituary requested expressions of sympathy be donated in his memory to Project Place. It was the teenage boy that Dick Bavley had assigned to himself as a foster son that discovered Bavley's lifeless body.
He knew the gig was up, He was going to prison, and he knew it. He was into his study writing for a long time, and I was kind of a stupid kid in some ways. I didn't really put it together what he was doing. And he came out and he asked me, he says, will you go to Texas with me? Asking me, right? And I said, no, Bavley, I don't, what am I going to go to Texas for? See, I didn't appreciate the seriousness of what was going on at the time. I knew something happened. I knew the kid stole the gun, but I found out later that Bavley was, he was going to go to prison, He goes into the bathroom. Now he's in the bathroom for, I don't know, long time. Then he comes out, and I guess he was going to bed, So I just stayed up watching television. And then I went to the bathroom, and I hear him snoring. I mean, like loud. I mean, he was snoring. So I go in. I said, Dick, I'll go to Texas. He goes, sorry, no, like that. Now I can't wake him up, and I turn on the light. His lips are turning purple, right? So I call the ambulance. And I guess he died at the hospital or something. That was the catalyst that started what they called the Boston sex scandal.
A month later, the Boston Police, the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office, and the Mass State Police created a task force to investigate Dick Bavley and any others involved. In 1975, the Boston Herald published this headline: Foster Homes Probe Launched. Cases of 5,500 children to be reviewed.
I'm walking down the Common, on the Common side, the Boston on Tremont Street. These guys stop, and they get out of the car, and they said, come on. I said, oh, man, what's this all about? So I guess we went up to some office. It's like the Attorney General's offices. I don't know. They were working for the Attorney General at the time. The state police, the plainclothes guys, they look like linebackers for the Patriots, they're these big guys. So they were asking me a bunch of questions. They're showing me pictures. Who's this? Who's that? Who's this? You know him? Who's this? They got me in the middle of the room in a chair. I'm telling you the truth, I don't know what it was all about at the time, but evidently they were investigating a whole bunch of people. I don't know. I guess some of them were well-to-do,
In January of 2022, I sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the Mass Attorney General's office. I received an email saying that there was no information on file regarding this interdepartmental state task force investigating the trafficking of foster children. But I did get an incredibly detailed report of a year-long investigation by an exceptional homicide detective, which was what led to the task force investigation. I asked Dick Bavley's co-worker, Lillian Jackson, if there was anyone else working with Dick Bavley to supposedly help runaway boys from Project Place. That's when she told me about Father Paul Shanley.
We also had Father Paul Shanley that we would send kids to for camp. And I was just appalled. We had no idea. He seemed like this nice priest who came and helped. People were helping us because we didn't have any money. But he said, well, send them to me and I can, get some summer camp scholarships for these kids and some clothes. And we came across such a cool dude type guy.
Father Paul Shanley is a notorious pedophile priest from the Boston Archdiocese. He was considered a street priest who counseled runaway boys. Father Paul, as he was called, also publicly endorsed the benefits of man-boy love. We'll have a whole episode on the priest and what was happening in Boston in the 1970s. Here again is Dick Bavley's former foster son.
See, there was this place on Charles Street, right? It was the old South Church. That's where Paul Shanley used to be hanging out there. That was the pedophile priest. And he was a friend of Dick Bavley, my guardian. Dick Bavley used to talk about the guy a lot. And I knew him myself because he used to come around the bus station, talk to the kids. Maybe Shanley would bring him kids that, I think they were kind of networking.
There's another counselor from Project Place who wasn't willing to be recorded for the podcast, but he told me about his experience with Dick Bavley. Here's what he said. Several teenage boys from Project Place confided in the relatively inexperienced 21-year-old counselor. They told him that they had been going to drug-fueled parties at the mansion of a local millionaire who lived in Beverly Farms, Mass. The counselor confided in the experienced social worker, Dick Bavley, convinced something needed to be done to protect the boys, and Bavley would help. Bavley suggested he and the counselor drive from Boston to the suburban home of the millionaire to approach him directly about the boys' claims. The counselor trusted Bavley and was comforted by the fact that he had a license to carry a gun. The young counselor said the millionaire greeted Bavley and him at the door and brought them into a large conference room where Bavley instructed the counselor to tell the millionaire what the boys had been telling him. At one point, the millionaire left the room to take a call, and the counselor could overhear him talking on the phone. Whoever he was talking to, it was clear they knew the counselor, and the conversation was about him. This scared the counselor, and he told Bavley he wanted to leave immediately. As the young counselor was expressing his concern for the boys on the ride home, Dick Bavley suggested the young counselor should go undercover at one of the drug-fueled parties, pretending to be a teenage boy to get more information. That's when the counselor said he realized Dick Bavley was somehow involved in all of this. When I asked the counselor if he remembered the name of the wealthy millionaire whose house he and Bavley went to, he told me he would never forget it. The millionaire is a man named Roger Spear. When I heard that, it was one of those moments when the puzzle started to get filled in. It was a huge piece. I already knew the name Roger Spear. He had been mentioned to me previously by another child who had been abused in the 70s. And Roger Spear was a Massachusetts millionaire who would be one of dozens of men arrested in 1977 in what was called a child sex ring in Revere, Mass., just a few years after Dick Bavley and the counselor's visit. Roger Spear would also be accused of murder involving a young hustler, as he was called, and another young man was found dead in Spear's home. He was said to have died of an overdose. The book, The Boston Sex Scandal, isn't just about Dick Bavley. In fact, Dick Bavley's story is merely the introduction to a much darker tale. If you or someone you know is a victim of child sex abuse, please reach out to the National Sex Abuse Hotline. It's available 24/7 for free. The number is 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673. Act 2. All roads lead to Revere. This is attorney Tom Peisch, who was the prosecutor in one of the most notorious and least talked about cases in Boston history, a case referred to as the Revere boy sex ring.
I got a job as an assistant district attorney in Boston. I was assigned to a division of the DA's office called the Suffolk County Investigation and Prosecution Project. SKIP that specialized in organized crime and white-collar cases. After about a year at SKIP, I was assigned to assist in the investigation of a case which later became the celebrated so-called Revere sex cases. We put together an affidavit for an application for a search warrant. The police went to the apartment and found a large number of photographs of young boys in compromising positions. And the police then set about to find these youngsters and were told just an unbelievably sordid story about what had gone on in that apartment. Most of these young boys were so-called street kids, came from broken homes, difficult backgrounds. The owner of the apartment, a man named Peluso, made it kind of a hangout. Peluso had a network of adults who enjoyed the sexual and other company of young boys. But we put together the appropriate evidence, brought it to a grand jury, which returned the indictments, and the rest was, as they say, history.
I had the opportunity to interview a few of the boys that had spent time at Richard Peluso's house on Montague Ave in Revere, Massachusetts. One of the boys was Dick Bavley's former foster son, who you heard from in Act 1.
There was guys paying to have sex with kids. In fact, there were seasoned kids out there, you know. And rather than have sex with the guy, they would bring a naive kid like me up there so that they could get high and everything without doing anything. You know what I mean?
Dick Bavley's former foster son explained to me that teenage juvenile delinquents would recruit prepubescent boys to bring them to pedophiles. On Friday, December 9th, 1977, the Boston Globe ran a front-page story with the headline, 24 Indicted in Boy Sex Ring Probe, and the subheading, Police Say Operation Revere Based. The article reports that in the spring of 77, a school bus driver, Frank Damiano, was arrested and sentenced to life in prison for the rape of multiple children. It was Damiano's arrest and another suspected child prostitution ring in the North End of Boston that led police to an apartment in Revere, Massachusetts. According to the Boston Globe, quote, of the 24 men indicted, 17 were allegedly involved in a Revere-based operation in which young boys were used for homosexual acts and as models for pornographic photographs. 7 other men were allegedly involved in similar crimes at other sites in Suffolk County. As many as 63 boys were believed to have been involved in the Revere, Massachusetts operation, end quote. News reports indicate the men traveled to Revere from their homes in Washington, D.C., Connecticut, Florida, and Georgia, paying between $30 and $50 for each visit. The boys were paid between $5 and $10 each. Court records indicate boys as young as 8 were included in the ring. The Boston Globe reported the children were from Revere, Lynn, Saugus, Chelsea, and East Boston. Among them were several state wards, also known as foster children, at least one of whom was assigned to the home of one of the suspects, according to investigators. Sound familiar? Remember, this is just 2 years after corrupt social worker Dick Bavley died. According to the paper, several of the defendants were wealthy men who had boys assigned to them as an inducement to invest in pornographic films. The district attorney at the time, Garrett Byrne, also referred the case to Los Angeles detectives because it's reported at least one of the children had been brought to the West Coast to appear in a pornographic film, child pornography. You heard that right. In 1977, just a few years after disgraced Massachusetts social worker Dick Bavley had been exposed for allegedly trafficking foster children, resulting in a statewide joint task force investigation between the AG's office, the state police, the Boston police, and the Department of Welfare, another group of men identified as pedophiles were trafficking foster children and runaway boys in Revere, Massachusetts. In addition, the Boston Globe reported, quote, the investigation, which led to 7 separate indictments unrelated to the activities at Peluso's apartment, reportedly uncovered sexual acts with children at a waterfront apartment in Boston, a street in the Back Bay, an apartment elsewhere in Revere, and a karate school, end quote. Here again is the former foster son of disgraced social worker Dick Bavley. The foster son was also ultimately considered what was then called a child prostitute, and he spent time at Richard Peluso's apartment in Revere.
Most of the Johns I was with, they always took photographs. These guys had tons of little Polaroid, you know. Oh man, they had tons of pictures of kids and stuff. A lot of these guys like to take pictures, you know. I looked like a little girl. I had the long hair. Everybody used to call me, oh, he's a beauty, he's a beauty. I got no chest hair, no leg hair. I never had, pedophiles like that. It was a network. You know what I mean? A lot of times we get paid to have sex with girls in front of the joint, you know. We did. That was a whole network. It wasn't just boys. It was girls, too.
Here again is former prosecutor Tom Peisch.
There were small amounts of money exchanged, as I remember it. There were payments made. There were a lot of pictures. In fact, that's how we were able to make the case, because they were stashed in this apartment underneath a heater, as I remember it, and the police found them when the search warrant was executed. Some of them had gone back a number of years. Pictures of these young boys in various positions, not many of them nude, but certainly suggestive, and some completely benign. But there was a huge trove of them, as I remember, several hundred.
What happened to those?
It's a good question. So some of them were marked as evidence before the grand jury, and I don't know what became of them. There was never an appeal, so there may not have been any reason to keep them.
Richard Peluso, the owner of the Revere apartment, had actually once lived with Frank Damiano, the North End school bus driver. Damiano ended up with over 40 counts of child rape, but Peluso agreed to testify against men involved in the ring. Several supporters of the men allegedly involved in the child trafficking ring quickly formed a group to begin fundraising for their legal cost. At first, the group called themselves the Boston Boise Committee, named after a similar scandal that occurred years earlier in Boise, Idaho. The Boston Boise Committee would eventually rename themselves, becoming the first publicly identified organized pedophile group in the United States, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, NAMBLA. In 1977, the Boston Herald printed a photo of the men being arrested along with their names. Dr. Donald Allen, a child psychologist affiliated with Children's Hospital in Boston; James P. Dahlman, a teacher at the private Fessenden School in Newton, Mass; Arthur Claridge, an assistant headmaster at the private Fessenden School in Newton, Mass; Roger E. Spear, millionaire and investor, the same Spear who we just heard about in Act 1, involved with Dick Bavley; Edward Meady, karate instructor; Mark Davis, juvenile probation officer; Lou White, salesman; David White, security guard; George Dreyfus, Harvard-educated psychologist with the Lindemann Mental Health Center; Frank Damiano, school bus driver; Henry Rideout, Donald Harris, and Whitney Chase, a lobbyist from Washington, D.C. Interestingly, those who supported the men who were charged with sexually abusing dozens of boys, some as young as 8 at the time, claimed the public and media reaction to their crimes amounted to a witch hunt and outright homophobia. They were trying to attach pedophilia to the legitimate gay rights movement, suggesting that pedophiles had a right to love who they wanted as well, and that we're inhibiting children's rights by not allowing them to have sex with adults. Here again is Tom Peisch, the Suffolk County prosecutor who worked directly on the case.
These events took place in the aftermath of the free love movement that grew out of the 1960s. And there was a pretty deep division among the gay community about these cases. On the one hand, you had establishment type gay people like Elaine Noble, who was a state representative, a very prominent, very thoughtful woman who immediately denounced the conduct of these defendants. And then on the other hand, you had the organization that ultimately became the North American Man-Boy Love Association, NAMBLA, who advocated very strongly in favor of the defendants, attacked the proposition that the law did not permit consent under a certain age, and were quite active and vocal in saying that this conduct should not have been criminal, should not have been punished criminally.
The organization supporting the defendants in the Revere case, which ultimately named themselves NAMBLA, falsely claimed there was no organized pedophilia or child pornography as part of the Revere case. This despite hundreds of photos being seized, and one of the defendants, at least, being found with child pornographic films and cameras. They believed the civil rights of men loving boys was being violated. They hosted an event at the Arlington Street Church in Boston, where noted author and activist Gore Vidal spoke on behalf of what they called themselves, boy lovers. Here's part of the speech from that event with an introduction from none other than the author of the Boston sex scandal, John Mitzel.
I don't think it's inappropriate to characterize what's coming down as nearly a state of siege against the gay community and anyone interested in civil liberties. I think, though, that one of the best moments is tonight, to say that Gore Vidal is with us here tonight, is standing with us tonight, and is supporting us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Gore Vidal.
There's a newspaper here called, what is it called again? No, the Boston Globe. A newspaper which has had fits of responsibility in the past. But apparently lost its head when this thing began. The headline was 24 in child porn case at the Boston Globe. Well, there was no child. Child pornography, that's another code word. I mean, that immediately sounds like 6-year-olds being raped. Now, there was no child pornography involved in the Revere Beach capers. The state really has no business in regulating the morals of consenting adults and adolescents. Much complaint has been made about men and boys. Well, the man is in a stronger position, the boy has a weak character, or can be modeled by the man. This is not necessarily so. Relationships are very subtle. Who does the manipulation is a quite delicate matter, and it's a very delicate issue. But I would think that wherever no coercion took place, where two parties of whatever gender or age come together, that this is no business of the state, this is no business of grown people to fret about. If parents are worried about their children, well, they should have done the work in the family and not suddenly find themselves in the position of having a witch hunt and re-invoking the spirit of nearby Salem. Yet when you think about it, should there be such a thing as statutory rape? That sounds to me like a contradiction. We have here another fascinating thing that at this moment, there are 100 men are now serving life or multiple life sentences in Massachusetts for nonviolent sex acts with boys under 16. 100 men serving life for something that they entered into of their own free will, a relationship which we cannot judge. No force was used. The boy involved in the case was, as far as we know, not damaged and was perfectly willing to go through with this. This seems to me barbarous. And there are boys 16 to 18 who have been charged with sex with boys between 12 and 15. I mean, this is getting theological.
So while noted author Gore Vidal was making jokes about statutory rape in children in order to raise money for the defendants, Tom Peisch was preparing to prosecute them. Here's Tom Peisch.
There was a fundraiser that was held at the Arlington Street Church, and I remember vividly picking up the newspaper the day after this fundraiser and opening the newspaper and seeing the featured speaker at the fundraiser for these defendants was Gore Vidal, the novelist. And I remember opening the newspaper and seeing a picture of Gore Vidal and then Superior Court Chief Justice Robert Bonin, who had attended this fundraiser with his wife. And I remember thinking to myself, gee, that's a little weird. This is the judge who's going to be assigning the judge that will actually hear these cases. And it turned out to be a huge controversy and led to Judge Bonin's being the subject of disciplinary proceedings and ultimately resigning. It was very important to me that our decision to prosecute these cases was vindicated, and it was.
Andy Puglisi is one of dozens of children who went missing or were found murdered in Massachusetts in the 1970s and whose cases remain unsolved. If you have information about Andy or any of the unsolved cases of missing or murdered children, please call 1-855-MA-SOLVE. That's 1-855-MA-SOLVE. That's the number for the Unresolved Case Unit for the Massachusetts State Police. You can always also contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. That number is 1-800-THE-LOST. Act 3, Boys to Men. One of the men arrested in the 1977 Revere sex ring was the assistant headmaster of a prominent private school, the Fessenden School, in Newton, Mass. That man's name is Arthur Claridge. Arthur Claridge ended up becoming a witness for the prosecution in the Revere case and was not tried for his crimes against children. Here again is Tom Peisch.
Well, I remember Claridge because he testified for us as a government witness. He was the main procurer of the adult network. He was the link between the adult network and the Peluso apartment. At the time, he had a pretty significant administrative job at the Fessenden School in Newton.
In 1977, Arthur Claridge was arrested with one of his colleagues from the same Fessenden School, a teacher named James Dahlman. Incredibly, despite 2 staff members being arrested for the sexual abuse of children in what became known as the Revere sex ring, Fessenden School administrators insisted in the Boston Globe that no children from the school had been sexually abused at that time. But we learned through our interview with Dick Bavley's former foster son that was the farthest from the truth.
Oh, yeah, there was a guy named Arthur Claridge. We used to call him Press. And he used to go over to Richie Peluso's house, too. I used to see them cruise the bus station. He brought me over to the Fessenden School. Arthur Claridge had an apartment on the grounds of that Fessenden School. And I could describe it to a T. I remember it like it was yesterday.
So according to Bavley's former foster son, he was being trafficked from Revere, Massachusetts to Newton, Massachusetts at a private wealthy school, the Fessenden School, by the assistant headmaster of the school. Yet according to Fessenden administrators in 1977, nobody was abused at their school. Clearly, the 1977 investigation fell short. And while the assistant headmaster and teacher were removed from the Fessenden School, no one seemed to understand that students at the school were also being sexually abused by Arthur Claridge and James Dahlman. In 2016, the Boston Globe published a spotlight team investigation into pedophilia in dozens of private schools in New England, including the Fessenden School in Newton. The investigation was focused primarily on students of the school, dating back to the 1970s and earlier. The Globe series made little to no connection to the Revere ring that was happening at the same time in the 70s, including many of the same pedophiles, or the fact that there were boys from Revere that were brought to the Fessenden School to be abused there. The Fessenden School administration hid this information for some time, but in 2011, they sent a letter to alumni admitting that 16 former students had come forward to describe their abuse at the hands of at least 5 individuals who were members of the community in the 60s and 70s. More than 40 years after their abuse, Fessenden students John Sweeney and Adrian Hooper came forward for the first time. They held a press conference to share the horror of their sexual abuse as children by men, including former Fessenden assistant headmaster and Revere sex ring defendants, Arthur Claridge and teacher James Dahlman.
Good morning. My name is John Sweeney. I'm 57 years old, and I was abused by Arthur Claridge at the Fessenden School. To my left is Adrian Hooper. What happens to all of us sex abuse victims? I've got post-traumatic stress disorder. We bury this trauma. It's severe, and we bury it because of the shame.
Remarkably, Adrian Hooper had remembered some of the abuse that occurred at the Fessenden School, but at the press conference, Adrian fell to his knees when he saw a picture of Arthur Claridge for the first time in decades. And memories that he had repressed, clinically described as dissociative amnesia, came flooding back. This is a conversation I had with Adrian about that experience.
I was 11 years old when I got sent there, and a lot of my memories had been repressed. I kind of always knew bad stuff happened there. And it wasn't until the Boston Globe story and me, doing the press conferences with John that I saw pictures of Arthur Claridge and some other teachers. And then all of a sudden my memories started flooding back in. I got to tell you, the last couple of years I've been really struggling with, depression and anxiety. It was Arthur Claridge and another teacher. It might have been Dahlman. I don't know if Dahlman was even there then, but it was another teacher, and they were videoing me and some other boys, and they told us it was an ancient Mayan ceremony. they had us doing things to each other that I'd really rather not go into detail, but, it was all of sexual nature, and they were filming it.
The other Fessenden student, John Sweeney, shared his abuse by Arthur Claridge, John Dahlman, and another of the Revere defendants, the millionaire, Roger Spear, the same Roger Spear that was identified in Act 1 by the Project Place counselor working with Dick Bavley. Remember, Spear was a millionaire who hosted drug-fueled parties that included runaway and throwaway boys and wealthy men. Spear ultimately became a suspect in the murder of a man described as a young hustler a few years later. All charges were dropped against the millionaire Roger Spear, including those in Revere. Here is former Fessenden student and victim, child sex abuse survivor John Sweeney.
I'm telling you, and people think that I'm crazy, okay? When I tell them that they hit only one house in Revere, they only found out about the one house. At the same time, they were doing this stuff at Spear's house, okay? I told them all about Spear's house in Wellesley. And you know what's even more messed up? These guys, I'm convinced of this, right? That they have got so much power still in the media because nobody in the media wants to cover that story. I tried to get Spotlight to listen to that, right? I tried to get Spotlight to go back, okay? Because they said, tell me about the, Spear and all this other shit, So I told them, I says, listen, that place in Revere, okay, wasn't the half of it.
I know this episode is a lot to process. Believe me, it was a lot to figure out. But let me take a minute to put things into context. Supposedly, the breakup of these child sex rings in Revere and Boston happened in 1977, but court records indicate the Boston and Revere rings had been operating as early as 1971 through 1977, which fits in with Dick Bavley's abuse of foster children. Remember the interdepartmental task force created to investigate all of this in 1975? Yet we're told there are no records available from the Attorney General's office. We did find some comprehensive files from another department, and there'll be more of that to come. And ironically, when the lawsuits started to come from the students at the Fessenden School, remember Dick Bavley's foster son? He tried to file a lawsuit as well, but the Fessenden administration said the statute of limitations had passed, and Fessenden administrators said he wasn't even a student here. Basically, what do these pedophile rings all have in common? They generally include wealthy professional men from around the country, trafficking boys considered throwaway children. They include people in positions of power, priests, police officers, attorneys, judges, and they're almost always abusing poor kids. Poor kids who may have already been abused or neglected. Kids who are rarely, if ever, believed. Kids that have little or no social capital, who don't get much media coverage, unless they're private school students. And even then, only 40 years later. The Revere investigation extended to Los Angeles, California, with defendants from Michigan, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., and around the country. And at the same time, 1970 to 1979, there are dozens of unsolved cases of missing and murdered children in Massachusetts, some of whom we know had direct contact with some of the defendants in the Revere case, and that were certainly in the same proximity as the Revere case. Several of the children have similar causes of death and fit the profile of the type of boys the men exploited: prepubescent children and juvenile delinquents, boys who are attractive and could be easily mistaken for girls. Here's a conversation I had with Andy's mother, Faith, about when she went to Revere, Massachusetts back in 1977. Remember, we heard this in an earlier episode, but I want to make sure you're making the connection to this sex ring.
They had confiscated some children from this apartment in Revere, and that's all I had to hear. And I was like, children, I want to see if my son's among them. That's when I went to the FBI in Boston. They were very selective in what pictures I could look at, and they had like this cutout where they'd only let me see a portion of the picture. One little boy that had the framework of Andy, but his hair had been dyed blonde, and you could tell that the hair had been dyed. It wasn't a natural blonde. I don't know how Andy's case became this big. I don't know. Was he kidnapped for child trafficking? I don't know.
Incredibly, I also came across a book called Child Pornography and Sex Rings by Ann Burgess, which documents multiple child sex rings in Massachusetts in the 1970s and 1980s. Join us in a bonus episode for my conversation with Ann Burgess. Were any of these men involved in those cases of missing and murdered children? Who knows? It's hard to tell. Most of the separate police districts didn't communicate with each other about these cases. Like I said, there's no database of unresolved cases from the 1970s. No one in law enforcement has looked at these cases collectively, as far as we know. And we know of at least one pedophile priest in Massachusetts who was allegedly part of an organized ring and was named as the person responsible for the murder of one of the boys from the 1970s, whose case had remained unsolved for decades until we started asking questions about it. We'll talk about that more later in the season. Next time on Open Investigation, Episode 4, Scope and Severity. Learn how organized networks and child pornography rings across the United States were exposed in the late 70s, culminating in United States congressional hearings on child exploitation and creating new federal laws that helped form the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. If you find our investigation compelling, please consider joining our Patreon as a supporter, which helps us continue the work. This is an independent podcast, and we're doing our best to investigate and bring awareness to these unsolved cases. You can also help out by offering a rating or commenting on the show on Apple Podcast. This helps us get more listeners and may lead to more information. If you want to learn more about additional research on individual cases, check out our website and join us on Patreon. If you have a tip or any information on these unresolved cases, please contact the Mass State Police Unresolved Case Unit at 1-855-MA-SOLVE, SOLVE. If you want to reach out to me, you can email me at openinvestigationpod@gmail.com. This episode was produced, written, and hosted by me, Melanie Perkins McLaughlin. Editing by Mike Joshua. Original music and additional editing by Drew O'Doherty. Consulting producer, Angel Wood. Graphics and website design by Cheryl Crawford Design and Angel Wood. Research by Melissa Ellen and Maggie Schneider. Production assistance by Darren McFadden, Sarah Ruminap, and Alexandra Vega. Our social media producer is Carla DeStefano. And special thanks to George. You know who you are.